the next question I want us to raise is, well, this stuff here, how's it calculated? And I'm going to pose that question to you guys. How do you think they work out? How are they going to work out in 2014, 82.25 years is the life expectancy of a person in Australia on average? What do you reckon, sir? Now, the census is a very natural place for our minds to go because we think, oh, this is country-wide information. So therefore, you'd expect, like, the census is one of the only things that we can know that is, like, comprehensive. However, I will point out to you really quickly, this cannot be census information. Can't be. Before we get to what it actually is, think about how often does a census take place?
5 years.
Let me tell you how often it doesn't happen. Answer.
Every year.
It does not happen every single year. Right? So whatever this is, it's not census information. Okay? Secondly, if you've been with your parents when they're filling out their census, they don't ask about, and nor do they ask, is anyone here about to die? You know, going to that. That's not information you can get from a census. Nick?
Is it a HDI, human development?
Okay, so the HDI is very closely related to this. It's another metric that people use to try and compare countries and that kind of thing. You want to suggest?
Don't they have, when the government people...
The government.
Okay, I don't do any kind of human studies.
That's okay.
So,
Can't you predict the life expectancy from someone's like death rate?
Okay, so life expectancy, this is an important idea. Underneath, how's it calculated? I want you to write down life expectancy versus...
So what's the question you're asking? How is it
How's it that question?
expectancy?
That question. Yeah. How is this thing? How do they draw this graph?
Mortality.
Yeah. Okay.
go to the death rate.
Just go to the morgue, find out the average age.
So,
The point I was making.
government people. The technical term is the Registry of Births, Deaths, and Marriages. Okay. These are the people who issue obituaries and all that kind of thing. They know the age of every person when they die, right? Has to be reported. Well, it's supposed to be anyhow. And so for that reason, if you just have a look at, in a particular time, at what age are people dying? Some people are going to die older than this, obviously. Some people will die younger, sadly. And then you're going to have a, what's that shape? Think back a couple of topics. You're going to have this distribution, right? This bell curve. What's it? That normal distribution, thank you. So you're going to get something like this, right? You're going to get what you expect to be a normal distribution because it's just like many other things, something which we measure which has variation and elements of randomness in it. And then from that, they construct this big thing called a life table. That's actually a really important phrase, a life table. The life table includes just horrendous numbers of ages and values and different factors that contribute to people passing away whether they pass away early or later or whatever. Okay. So, if we know the average age, if we know the ages at which everyone is passing away, you can just work out an average, and that's pretty much it. Okay. So, how's it calculated? That's the basic essence of it. Where do these numbers come from? The other important question for us is, what are the factors that lead into this? Now, we've already discussed a small number of these. For instance, we talked about fertility rate. Okay. By the way, there's at least two ways in which fertility rate connects to life expectancy. Right? We noticed the fertility rate dropped and life expectancy increased. Why? What do you think?
More resources because there's less people.
So you could say, if there are less people being born, there's less of a strain on the resources of society, so we can care for people better. That's plausible. It's not usually identified as a reason because that takes too long to actually have an effect, if that makes sense, right? It takes that long, roughly, okay? However, it's still an idea, and I want to suggest there's so many factors.
I know that my grandparents had heaps of kids because they wanted kids to work on the farm, and maybe like when you have more money or you're more stable, you can have less kids.
Yep. So, for example, my parents come from families where there were 8 and 10 children, respectively. Okay? And one of the reasons for that is because they knew, well, they just didn't have enough money, public education is not a thing, right? So we're just going to need people to work. Just going to need people to work. Now think about this. What that correlates to is actually this. You see this? If your country overall is poorer, and so therefore people are, children are going to be born, and we're going to press them into work. It was a pretty normal thing, 8, 10, basically the first half of the children get almost no schooling. They just work. So that the second half can actually have an education and potentially go to another country if you've got enough money to do that, like my family did. So there's a correlation here between, did you know that word, by the way? I'm not just throwing that out as a random word. There's, as a specific idea. There's a correlation between fertility rate and GDP, right? As this increases, we have the opportunity for this to decrease. We don't need to have as many children, and so therefore we can funnel more into them, we'll have more money, and they will survive for longer. They get better healthcare, okay? One of the factors that we often don't think about, and anyone who has, this is just I hate to pick this out, but it's the most obvious example. Anyone who has family back in India, I have quite a few friends who, they would go back, right? And, we would think, oh, I'm pretty average height here. And then they go back to India, and they look like giants. Why? Same genetics, like these are literally, it's my family, it's my cousins or whatever, right? But the nutrition, again, coming back to this, is so different that people are they're just shorter and smaller because they just don't have the caloric intake to actually be healthier, right? So all of these things are all interconnected. So when we say factors, right? The first thing I want you to know, and I just mentioned a few just there, right? There are lots of them. There are multiple factors. They all contribute. The key question for us mathematically is, what's the correlation between any of these? Can we think about life expectancy versus the GDP? Can we think about life expectancy versus, say, the level of education that a person has? Life expectancy versus, spending on health that a government does? All of these things contribute. And if you graph them against each other, the closer the correlation is, the more reason there is for us to target that as an idea. Okay? Does anyone have any questions about that? Does it make sense? I asked you to open up your textbooks. If you haven't done that, do that now. I just want to point you to an example of what this looks like. Okay, so here's 13H. Now, what the syllabus expects of us is to be able to look at data related to life expectancy and be able to interpret it, okay? So these kinds of things you have seen before, but it's kind of like, I've never seen it exactly like this. What are we looking at right now? Number one, you've got two graphs. What's the difference between them? It's time. Very good. So we're looking at this and then 10 years forward, okay? But then within each graph, you've got lots of different subsections, okay? For example, there's green and there's red. What's that about? Gender. That's about gender, and you can see why if you just have a look at the numbers, why they pull that out, right? Gender is a huge predictor of your life expectancy, okay? In fact, there's a lot of research that's been done into, if people get married, right, and the vast majority of people do, when people get married, if the wife passes away first, the husband the widower isn't far behind. But the reverse is not true, usually, right? If the husband passes away, the widow can sometimes live for 10, 20, 30 years afterwards. Okay? So this contributes, this is where the debate is, right? So you can see why they pulled that out. So we've looked at graph 1, graph 2. We've looked at each half and how they're different. What about as you go down the graph? What's changing? Life expectancy is increasing. What's it increasing in relation to? What's each row about? Yeah, very good. Right over here. Okay? So then you can ask the question. I remember I talked to you last lesson right at the very end about correlation versus causation. Okay? Do you think, real question, genuine question, do you think having more of an education that actually causes your life expectancy to increase?
Yeah.
No.
Because
no.
Okay, pause. A lot of you said yes. Give me a reason. Give me one reason.
Oh, wait, I was going to say no because
You say no?
just because you've completed high school, it doesn't mean that if your family, it's about how much money your family has and how much like kids apply. Because what if you've got like some like major disease and you need to pay like lots of medical treatment? If they have that, you could live longer than if someone had the same disease and they're like hadn't completed high school, their family might not have as much money to pay for that sort of die earlier.
Okay, alright, so there's this point here that education is not like some magic wand, okay? It's not as though, like, oh, I have a terminal illness, quick, put me into university and I'll live longer. It's not like that. But at the same time, right, that was funnier than I thought it was. At the same there clearly is a relationship. Raquel, were you going to say yes or no?
Like sort of yes, because
Yeah, go ahead.
if
What
you
do you
have
think?
a higher like level of education, you're like more aware. Like for example, like smoking or drugs, like
Yeah, you have more
what's the
access to
effect
health and
of what it has,
understand.
of what it actually
Yeah.
has on you, like obesity.
Okay, this is very true. So it's a genuine fact that as we climb up here, right, or climb down, or wherever, as we get more education, you are literally understanding more about the way the world works, more about the way money and health work, which actually is going to cause higher life expectancy, right? Does that make sense?
Don't you
Or
also
what were you
have
going to
access
say?
more resources?
I would say that it's
Sort of,
not
yes.
like it's not a direct correlation, but it has some correlation. Because like you look at like education and like a person that isn't well educated has like a higher chance of not being employed. And then a person that isn't employed has a higher chance of like not having enough money to pay for like housing and good and food, which has
Obviously
in itself
affect your
has
life
an effect
expectancy.
of life expectancy.
So, by the way, I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's so front and center, and obviously I am biased, but this is one of the reasons why governments around the world and NGOs, non-government organizations, when they're trying to work on life expectancy in like developing countries, one of the first places they go is education and schooling, because it's a keystone that leads to so many other things. There, I better get off my soapbox. You get the idea, okay? You can see how to read it in comparison, and so you can see, okay, well, what was the difference in life expectancy in 1996 between the most educated and the least educated males? Where am I looking in the graph? Looking at this graph? And I'm comparing the least educated here, 47, with the most educated, 54. So 7 years, which by the way, 7 years is a really long time to, like if you think about the age of it, that's a huge gap, okay? Later on, as you go over the page, you're going to have a look at the difference between different ethnicities within a country. Do you guys know about the life expectancy gap between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and everyone else? It's massive. It's enormous. What I advise you do is if you go ahead and Google, where I got this by the way, is just, if you Google Life Expectancy Australia, it'll just generate this for you. But if you scroll down teeny bit, what you'll see is the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. I highly recommend, this will not help you answer any questions, but it's just interesting and important stuff for you to know. If you go to their website, it breaks down life tables, as I was pointing out, across a whole bunch of different things, different countries, different kinds of, you can see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are specifically named because it's a specific target. So you can see, no, that's the wrong one. Here we go. You can see some of the data here, right? It's even more significant than the difference between genders, which is a really big deal. That's like biological difference. And here you can see 10.6 years lower than that of the non-Indigenous population. I said 7 years was a lot. Almost 11. That's crazy. Okay?